The topic of moral truth, values, and duties is an important one, and it's a hot topic today. It's not you couldn't say it's neglected because it's definitely discussed and debated at both the popular and academic levels in all spheres of life. This is a topic that is hotly debated. Now, one of the things that's most debated about moral truth is moral truth objective or subjective? Is moral truth objective or relative? I will use the term subjective and relative interchangeably. And I think, and I will argue today in this video, that if you hold to a form of relativism, whether it be social relativism or individual relativism, you hold to a fatally flawed view of moral truth. And I want to argue that the best view of truth is an objective view of moral truth. But in order to do that, I think we have to discuss in a respectful and appropriate manner all three of these theories of truth, which are really three leading theories of the way we look at moral truth. So is truth subjective or objective? That's the question we're answering today. And the answer I'm going to propose is that truth is objective. So let's get right into it. There are essentially two main types of relativism. One is known as individual relativism, and one is known as social or cultural relativism. Now, there may be branches or subsets of these types of theories, but individual and social relativism are the main ones. You really won't encounter many other relativistic theories than these two. They all stem back to individual and social relativism. Thus, I think in order to establish and reasonably conclude that objective truth is the most reasonable, we have to discuss and properly critique individual and social relativism. Now, I think that social relativism is actually a far harder topic to tackle than individual relativism. Thus, I will first begin with individual relativism and move on to social relativism. So let's get right into it. What does individual relativism say? Well, first of all, it's very popular. Individual relativism is booming, especially amongst younger people nowadays. It's very popular to say your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth, live and let live. Let's just tolerate everybody's views. Everything is correct. What you say goes. And what's interesting is oftentimes these people who do support individual relativism and say your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth, are actually quite dogmatic about certain truths like sexual freedom, like abortion, like economic issues, like different social political issues, which is rather interesting because to say your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth, but then to be dogmatic about your truth is quite interesting. It seems rather contradictory, but that's actually not the main thing I want to get into, even though I do think that is ironic and shows error within the belief. But the main thing I want to get into is a real philosophical critique of individual relativism. I don't want to just merely exchange rhetorical blows. I really want to make a philosophical critique of individual relativism because I think that's how we really have to do it in order to establish that our conclusion is the most reasonable. So, individual relativism argues that what is morally true, something is morally true for an individual. It is not objectively true. It's not universally true. It is not unchanging. Morality on individual relativism is dependent upon the viewer of the moral issue. It is subjective. It is changing. Truth evolves over time according to individual relativism. It is not universal. It is only upon the individual, even though individuals often share the same moral beliefs. And thus, truth in no sense of the word in individual relativism is objective. But there's some big problems with this. I will argue here that individual relativism is contrary to the laws of logic, and I do think we can create quite a good syllogism for this. Premise 1, any view contrary to the laws of logic is false. Premise 2, individual relativism is contrary to the laws of logic. And then the conclusion, therefore, individual relativism is false. Now, why do I say that? I have to obviously back up the premises. Let's examine premise 1. Any view contrary to the laws of logic is false. Now, this seems obviously true. The laws of logic are what keep us all together. We can't do science, we can't do math, we can't do philosophy, we can't do good thinking at all without the laws of logic. This is what the universe revolves around. I don't mean that literally, but I mean to say that we can't really exist in a functional way without the laws of logic. You can disregard them, but the truth is you live by them. To say that something is and is not is insane. To say that something can be this and at the same time not be this and in the same way is insane. We have to obey the laws of logic whether we like them or not. And this is indubitably true. And this is almost universally agreed upon by scientists, philosophers, thinkers of all divisions, disciplines, and sorts. So I think premise one is pretty much self-evident. Any view contrary to the laws of logic should be rejected. Now, premise two, this is the one that I think is the one that will spark the most debate. Individual relativism is contrary to the laws of logic. Now, I'm going to argue that individual relativism is contrary to the laws of logic, namely in that it violates the law of non-contradictions. And the law of non-contradictions says that something cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same way. And I'll give you an example of how individual relativism violates this principle of logic. Take the example of homosexuality. Now, unfortunately, in this video, I'm not able to address whether homosexuality is a morally good act or not. I have created content on that. I suggest you check it out on my YouTube. I do have opinions. I do think it's morally wrong, but unfortunately, I can't get into this. I can get into that on that video because it's not the purpose of this video. So say that someone, call him Joe, says that homosexuality is morally good, morally right, morally acceptable. And say that someone, Steve, says that homosexuality is morally wrong, morally not right, and should not be committed. Now, in individual relativism, technically, both Steve and Joe are correct because that's their individual truth. They decide what is morally true for them. Thus, it is true that homosexuality is right, and at the same time, in the same way, it's true that homosexuality is wrong on individual relativism, which is an asinine assertion. It cannot be that an act is right and wrong at the same time in the same way. Thus, clearly, individual relativism violates the laws of logic. And when an individual relativist says there is no absolute truth, they actually are self-refuting because they're saying it's absolutely true that there is no absolute truth. Thus, if there's one absolute truth, there is actually absolute truth. And individual relativism is completely self-refuting. And really, though it is a popular view, it is not a reasonable nor rational view to hold. And anybody who really takes time to consider it will come to the conclusion that individual relativism is worth rejecting. Thus, I think we firmly established that individual relativism is incorrect. Now, I want to move on to a more difficult version of relativism, which is social or cultural relativism. Now, social or cultural relativism argues that what is morally true or what is morally right is determined by the society in which one lives. So say that person A lives in society Z. Now, in society Z, whatever is true morally there is true for the person A that lives in society Z. So, to make this more applicable, you and I live in America now. Well, I don't know that I live in America. You might live somewhere else. But in America, certain things are morally acceptable and certain things are morally condemned. And that's really expressed in our laws and in our government's actions. Now, in a nation like, let's say, China, there's similar moral values. However, we do differ significantly on some areas, and that's expressed in their laws. But we can even take it even further. We can say back hundreds of years ago, in the southern states of the United States, slavery was morally accepted. And not only that, it was morally applauded. Whereas nowadays, slavery is almost universally condemned and morally repugnant, as it truly is. Now, on social relativism, what is morally right and true for society is morally right and true for the individual within that society. So if you were a member or if you lived in the Confederate South during the Civil War, which supported slavery and said slavery was morally right, then you, by default, because you live in that society, must believe that it is morally right that slavery is good. Now, obviously, you don't. I hope not, at least, because it's not. But that's the problem with social relativism. One's morals are put upon them by the society in which they live. Not to mention, ancient societies had a terrible view of women and children. They had a terrible view of lots of moral conditions and terms like slavery, like the selling of women as prostitutes. And all these things were not only, yes, of course, now as we've changed and as we advance, of course we look at them as morally wrong now, but not only are they morally wrong now, they were morally wrong then. But a social relativist has to say that in that time, hundreds, thousands of years ago, it was not only morally acceptable, but it was morally right, because that was the society's culture and codes. Thus, for social relativism, whatever a society believes is morally right, which is insane to say, especially considering the terrible practices practiced in so many societies nowadays, but even more so considering the terrible practices practiced in societies thousands of years ago. But a social relativist has to, in order to stay consistent with their views, say that what is right for any society is morally right for the individuals within that society. Furthermore, another critique of social relativism is that it doesn't allow, well, actually, it makes reformers criminals. And we all know of great reformers throughout the world, Martin Luther, Gandhi, though these men, of course, had their faults. They did great things. They brought about great reforms. But on social relativism, these men were wicked men. They were saying that their society's cultural and moral code was wrong, and thus they were going against the moral values put upon them by their society, violating moral goodness. And thus reformers of any type are morally wicked people committing nefarious acts. Thus, I think there are insuperable issues for the social relativist to overcome. Now that we've seen that both individual and social relativism don't work, we have to consider really the third option, which is objective morality. Now, on objective morality, moral truths and values are universal, they are binding, they are true regardless of opinion, regardless of preference. They are not dependent upon the person who believes in them. They are independent of humanity, and they are true for all eternity. Truth does not evolve. Though we can advance and realize moral truths better, that doesn't change the fact that they were true in the past. They were just as true in the past as they are now. That is what I mean by objective morality. Now, I think clearly that since we've seen that any form of relativism fails to provide a good moral theory, that objective moral theory is the best one. It's unequivocally the best one by a landslide. It allows us to say that an act is absolutely right or wrong, regardless of the society in which one lives, or regardless of one's personal preference or opinion. It's not a thing of I like chocolate, you like vanilla. It's a thing of no, this is actually morally right. This is actually morally wrong. This is good. This is evil. Now, I think we clearly see that this is the most reasonable conclusion, as I'm sure that you believe that it's objectively wrong for somebody to torture children. It's objectively wrong for somebody to murder another person. It's objectively wrong to purposelessly and just viciously lie and slander people. It's objectively wrong. It's not just wrong because you think it's wrong. It's not just wrong because the society says it's wrong. It's wrong because it is in itself wrong. It is ontologically wrong. Now, oftentimes people will combat this saying, well, why is it that cultures have come to such radically different views of truth? That's an epistemological question about truth. That's a question of, well, how do we come to know truth? I'm not making a claim about how we come to know truth. Of course, I do have opinions on that. That's a whole nother video. What I'm saying is I'm talking about an ontological foundation for truth. This is a question of ontology, not of epistemology. And I'm here to say that ontologically, there is no good, you can't account for moral truth on individual or social relativism. Now, maybe epistemologically you can, but that's irrelevant to our conversation. The question is something really objectively wrong? And the answer is clearly yes. Thus, I think we've seen clearly that moral values and duties are objective, not relativistic, not subjective. And we have excellent reason to believe in objective moral theory. Now, I'm going to make a subsequent video, which I hope you will watch. Check out my channel for that, on why objective moral values and duties point to the existence of God. And I will argue in that video that without God, objective moral values and duties cannot exist, but that is for another time, and I will post that soon. I hope this really gives you something to consider. I hope you realize the error and just erroneous falsity of any form of relativism and the absolute truth of objective morality. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you soon.